Today I'm going to speak about the recent advances in fibrillary glomerulonephritis. This is the outline of the talk. So the very first description of fibrillary glomerulonephritis was back in 1977. This was described by Rosenman in an Arab patient who had a very typical nephrotic syndrome. And on evaluation of the biopsy at that time, it was characterized as an amyloid-like material in the glomeruli, which is composed and contained immunoglobulins and complements, and on ultrastructural studies had a fibrillar structure, but the deposits did not stain with the typical amyloid stains. And that was the first description of fibrillary glomerulonephritis. Since that time, there have been several descriptions of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, and they were called non-amyloid fibrillotic glomerulopathy, among other terms. Now, fibrillary glomerulonephritis has a slight predominance in women. The mean age of presentation is between 40s and 60s. There has been an association in several of the studies that have been published that include over 25 patients. These are some of the studies that there is an association with autoimmune diseases. There is some association with hepatitis C, diabetes, and a smaller association with monoclonal gammopathy. Now, of the autoimmune diseases that have been associated with fibrillary glomerulonephritis, they include the list that I am showing here, which include systemic lupus erythematosus, Crohn's disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, Graves, and Sjogren's. Malignant neoplasms have been associated, both solid epithelial and hematological malignancies. And there has been an association with hepatitis C more than other viral infections. When you look at the clinical and laboratory features of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, nephrotic syndrome is seen in the studies that have documented this. Some have seen it as many as 50% of their cases, but at least a nephrotic range proteinuria is seen in a majority. Microhematuria, hypertension is another presentation. Hypocomplementemia is not a common feature of presentation. And again, most of these patients will progress to end-stage renal disease. So what are the defining pathological features of fibrillary glomerulonephritis? It's characteristically defined as Congo red negative deposits that on ultrastructural evaluation have randomly oriented fibrils that range from 12 to 24 nanometer in size. These fibrils lack a hollow center, and they characteristically stain with antisera to immunoglobulins by immunofluorescence, and they're usually polyclonal. Now, on light microscopy, you have glassy deposits within the mesangium, and often these deposits extend into the peripheral capillary wall, and they're characterized by variable PAS staining, silver negative stains, and they have different patterns of injury. The most common patterns of injury are mesangioproliferative, but you can have membranoproliferative patterns of injury, endocapillary proliferative patterns of injury. Some cases have membranous presentation, and even crescents can be seen. They're usually focal crescentic involvement in fibrillary glomerulonephritis, although there are some reports of diffuse crescentic glomerulonephritis. Now, on immunofluorescence, the glomeruli usually light up like a Christmas tree, and this is what I remember from Dr. Renke, all the teaching. It's a smudgy staining, and this is IgG. And you can see here that the large yellow arrow points to the smudgy deposits in the mesangium. And you also see a linear to pseudo-linear staining along the peripheral capillary walls. Now, if you look at the review of several of the larger series of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, almost all of the studies of fibrillary glomerulonephritis will have IgG, C3, and the vast majority show kappa and lambda light chain staining. You can have some amount of deposition of IgA, IgM, and C1q. Now, extraglomerular deposition was not commonly reported previously, but now is recognized in as many as 49% of cases have extraglomerular deposits along the tubular basement membranes. Now, staining of immunoglobulins with a light chain restriction is noted, but it's only in a smaller percentage of cases. And in those cases, you want to do a paraffin retrieval, paraffin immunofluorescence staining to make sure that monotypic staining on immunofluorescence, routine immunofluorescence, is not persistent on paraffin immunofluorescence staining. So here is again the smudgy staining of fibrillary glomerulonephritis. Usually it's IgG staining, there's C3 staining, kappa and lambda. And in the last panel here, you can see that these are extraglomerular deposits along tubular basement membranes and sometimes along the arterioles. And as I mentioned, the vast majority of fibrillary glomerulonephritis is characterized by a polyclonal staining. It's usually IgG4, and a small percentage of cases will have monotypic staining of immunoglobulin with an IgG subtype restriction and a light chain restriction. On electron microscopy, which has been very important to make the diagnosis of fibrillary glomerulonephritis until recently, you have a haphazardly arranged arrangement of fibrils, which are 12 to 24 nanometer in thickness. These fibrils are deposited in the mesangium, extend into the glomerular basement membranes, or both. And here you see the expanded mesangium with these deposits, and it's extending into a thickened glomerular basement membrane. And at high power, you see that there are these almost on a background matrix. You see randomly oriented, haphazardly arranged fibrils. And these range from 12 to 24 nanometer in size. So they are bigger than amyloid fibrils, and they do not have a central hollow bore, and they are not arranged in stacked parallel arrays like immunotactoid. And here again, at a higher power, you see them into the glomerular basement membrane along the subepithelial aspect. Now, traditionally, the deposits are Congo red negative, and that was one of the defining features of fibrillary glomerulonephritis. What is the differential diagnosis of fibrillary glomerulonephritis? Well, on ultrastructural studies, often you can get challenges with diabetic glomerulosclerosis, immunotactoid glomerulopathy, cryofibrinogen-related GNs, and amyloidosis. Now, in diabetes, in the nodular mesangial areas, you often have bundles of short fibrils, but and this is called diabetic fibrillosis, and it can be a challenge sometimes. Immunotactoid glomerulopathy, in fact, for years, there was a merging of the two conditions, and it wasn't clear whether they were a spectrum of a similar underlying pathology. Today, we know that is not the case, but immunotactoid glomerulopathy is also characterized by silver negative, variably PAS positive deposits, which can have different patterns of presentation. But they are extracellular, they are microtubules arranged in parallel arrays, they have central lumina, and the external diameter is 9 to 45 nanometers, slightly smaller in immunotactoid that's associated with CLL. And they too are arranged within the mesangium and subepithelial regions. Now, cryofibrinogen-related glomerulopathy, a more recently described entity, can also be a challenge because on ultrastructural studies, you see these organized arrays. They are larger fibrils, they have a tubular structure, and they have a hollow, they are arranged in this whorled pattern, and they are much larger than what you see in fibrillary glomerulonephritis. But the biggest and most challenging condition to differentiate fibrillary glomerulonephritis is immunoglobulin amyloidosis. And this is probably the most important differential diagnosis that has to be made. So here is amyloid, characterized again by replacing of the mesangium and peripheral capillary walls by this is PAS positive, the Bowman's capsule. So this is PAS weaker, silver negative, non-fusionophilic and smudgy acellular eosinophilic deposits, which are Congo red positive and show this anomalous color or birefringence when viewed under polarizing light. And look at the EM, you can see it's randomly oriented, non-branching fibrils, similar to fibrillary glomerulonephritis, but these are finer fibrils. But as one knows, this can be quite challenging to make a difference, differentiate them. Now, the challenges come when electron microscopy is not routinely performed, nor is it available everywhere, nor is it timely in terms of making a differential diagnosis. Sometimes you have to wait a long time for the EM report. Over-dependence on measuring fibril size can become a challenge. And then again, over-dependence on Congo red staining. And as one knows, over-dependence on any one technology is not a great idea, especially when the needs of a patient are dependent on an accurate diagnosis. And for longest time, Congo red negativity in fibrillary glomerulonephritis has been stressed, and it's important to differentiate between the two, fibrillary GN and immunoglobulin amyloid, because fibrillary GN is largely limited to the kidneys, less than 20% death rate within 5 years, and there is no effective therapy. Whereas immunoglobulin amyloid is a systemic disease. If it's untreated, the survival in immunoglobulin amyloidosis can be as short as 13 months. And once diagnosed, there is effective chemotherapy with and without stem cell treatment. So we had encountered 18 cases at the Mayo Clinic of weakly congophilic staining of what otherwise looked like typical fibrillary glomerulonephritis. Now, this was a case series that we published, and it was an important series that triggered a series of investigations that have helped us subsequently. These 18 cases, 13 were referred for mass spectrometry to the Mayo Clinic Mass Spec Lab. 5 were sent in pathology consultation because they were very challenging to the pathologist. And of the 13 that were sent for mass spec, 8 were sent directly because it was diagnosed as amyloid. They wanted to type the amyloid. And 5 was sent because the pathologist just did not think they were amyloid, though they were staining with Congo red and wanted to know for sure whether this was amyloid. One patient had actually been treated for amyloid and did not respond. And this was the background of further investigations. So amyloid typing by mass spectrometry has been done a long time at Mayo Clinic, and there had been several studies that had allowed the center to develop for mass spectrometry-based diagnostic techniques. And Dr. Sethi, as you know, has done a lot of work in this field. And he had also looked into some of these underlying fibrillary and fibril-like deposits to study laser microdissection and proteomic analysis. And you're looking for the universal molecular signature of amyloid, which is ApoE, SAP, and ApoA4. And if these are present in sufficient spectral counts, that helps make the diagnosis of amyloid. So these congophilic fibrillary glomerulonephritis were submitted for mass spectrometry. And we also had the wealth of several other glomerular diseases to compare the proteomic signature. And what I'd like to say for any study is that you don't work alone. You work in teams, you work in collaboration, and you work with your clinical counterparts. And that is something I've learned all along working at my undergraduate institution at CMC, working with Dr. Renke, and then at Mayo Clinic. It is a team science. And if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And so here we were at working on this congophilic FGN series, putting together all these other cohorts of cases. And then I got on May 27, 2016, from the hematologist and the bioinformatics specialist, an email, which I will never forget, and I've saved it obviously, saying there is something really, really cool here, Priya. We have something that we think is very, very important. It's DNA JB9. That was the first I've ever heard of that protein. And so in May 2016, this unique novel peptide protein was identified present in all FGN patients, regardless of whether they had chondrophilia or not. And so DNA JB9 was only detected in patients with fibrillary glomerulonephritis. It was not seen in amyloid. It was not seen in immunotactoid. It was not seen in IgA or any of diabetes or any of the other conditions that could mimic fibrillary glomerulonephritis. It was one of the top 10 proteins detected in fibrillary glomerulonephritis by mass spectrometry. And as I mentioned before, it was exclusively seen in fibrillary glomerulonephritis. So this led us to submit this paper, which we were very grateful for, recognized in the Journal of American Society of Nephrology. And at the same issue, another group published the validation of DNA JB9 being a putative autoantigen in fibrillary glomerulonephritis. Immunohistochemical studies, which really made a difference to diagnosis of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, was possible with using DNA JB9. As you all know, it's a very sensitive and specific marker. It's characterized by this smudgy extracellular glomerular staining. You can also see it along the Bowman's capsule. It's seen along tubular basement membranes. And I want to show that DNA JB9 is ubiquitous. It is present in several structures several organs in the body and several micro compartments. And that is not smudgy. This is in a normal, powdery, fine thing in the tubules. That is not what you're talking about. When you're saying a positive DNA JB9 for fibrillary, you are looking for this smudgy extraglomerular staining, not fine punctate staining. And here we have the DNA JB9 being positive in fibrillary glomerulonephritis and negative in amyloid, negative in IgA, and negative in diabetes in this panel. It's sensitive, and it's very sensitive, and it's very specific. We did have one positive case in what we at that time could not identify as fibrillary glomerulonephritis. It's a patient who was a smoker who had nodular glomerulosclerosis, but had hepatitis C viral infection. I think it was the early precursor of a very, very early fibrillary glomerulonephritis, but mass spec of that case did not show DNA JB9. And you know that if you only have a small amount, you may not have picked it up. It was positive, it was negative in two other cases of what we later called heavy chain fibrillary glomerulonephritis. And as you see here with immunohistochemistry, you can see it along the tubular basement membranes in the same smudgy fashion. You can see it along arterioles. And we also looked at a lot of autopsy stains, and we found it in one patient who had ITP, had her spleen removed, and we found that in the splenic arteriole, we had it, which suggested that DNA JB9 was not just restricted to the kidneys, it's potentially it's in circulation and was found in the splenic arteriole. For the longest time, this was our control till Dr. Renke rescued us and provided us with another control. But you should look for your cases of spleens in patients with underlying autoimmune disease. You might find fibrillary DNA JB9 deposits there. And here again, we found it along the tubular basement membranes corresponding to these deposits on EM. So what is the utility of DNA JB9 in the diagnosis of fibrillary glomerulonephritis? It really alleviates the need for electron microscopy for diagnosing fibrillary glomerulonephritis. It allows a prompt diagnosis within a day of a characteristic immunofluorescence. You can have fibrillary glomerulonephritis diagnosed, and especially when you have long turnaround times for electron microscopy. If you don't have electron microscopy, that is even better. And this is something that I find is a really valuable use of DNA JB9. especially I have practiced in India and I know that would be valuable. It distinguishes fibrillary from other lesions that are challenging, discriminates the rare cases of congophilic FGN, and in transplant, we have found it very useful for follow-up and early detection of recurrence. So what is DNA-JB9? It's a heat shock family chaperone protein, and it's localized to the endoplasmic reticulum. Its role is to help with the folding and unfolding of proteins. And it has a role in working with BIP, which is a heat shock protein. And BIP is responsible for working with the IRE dimerization and control of what proteins exit the endoplasmic reticulum. And therefore, together, they have a critical role in moderating misfolded proteins from being sent out into circulation. So in short, it protects the body from misfolded proteins, and it's induced in stressful environment infections. So what is the pathogenic role of DNA-JB9? Well, there are two possible roles. One is DNA-JB9 the actual autoantigen in fibrillary glomerulonephritis? In other words, is DNA-JB9 that protein that is misfolded, that is depositing? And does it, once deposited, induce an autoimmune response? And that's why you get the IgG, C3 kappa and lambda co-localizing with the fibrillary deposits? Or is it that you have a misfolded protein of IgG generated within the endoplasmic reticulum, which then causes an upregulation of the chaperone protein, which then attaches to the immunoglobulin and then gets deposited? So these are still unanswered questions, and we need to investigate them further. So is the DNA-JB9 protein itself abnormal? Well, in our series, when we looked at the sequence of the proteins that were detected, we found that the entire length of the mature protein was present without truncation, and therefore suggesting that we are not really dealing with an abnormal protein, although post-translation modification cannot be completely excluded. Is there a genetic alteration? And as you know, we don't see many familial cases of fibrillary glomerulonephritis, although there have been 5 families reported with fibrillary glomerulonephritis. We were able to sequence the DNA-JB9 from 2 patients that we had in our series, and we did not find an underlying mutation of significance, suggesting that maybe there is not a genetic alteration, at least in the vast majority. So is DNA-JB9 forming these fibrils that we see? That's the question that we still ask. But what we do know is that, as you see in this panel, here is DNA-JB9 stained with this red, and here's IgG stained with G and with green. And here they actually co-localize, suggesting that the DNA-JB9 and the IgG are co-localizing. And when we did immunoelectron microscopy, gold particles labeled with anti-DNA-JB9 were found along the length of the fibrils. So we know that DNA-JB9 is definitely with those fibrils. Is it the fibril? We still don't know, and that would require more a biochemical analysis. And then we went on to, we looked at serum tests for DNA-JB9, and we found that there is a complicated method of analyzing DNA-JB9, and that we would ideally want an ELISA, but there is potential to look for a serum DNA-JB9. And then we also want to say that DNA-JB9 is useful in following up your transplant patients. There is recurrence, but they usually recur only after 5 years, not before 5 years and by 10 years, suggesting that DNA-JB9 is not produced in the kidney, but it's actually a systemic disease with production outside of the kidney. And we think DNA-JB9 has a role in transplant biopsy evaluation. And so what is the future of DNA-JB9? We would ideally like to see some therapeutics to it. And so I'd summarize by saying, yes, DNA-JB9 is a novel marker of fibrillary GN. It has high sensitivity and specificity as an immunohistochemical marker. It's applicable in all renal laboratories across the globe. And together we need to explore therapeutic options. And it's always the best interest of the patient. So if we work together, we will do more. And I'd really specifically like to thank this team who helped with this study. And after that, of course, there is our entire Mayo panel. I can't thank enough. And of course, I'm indebted to Dr. Renke, who has always made a difference to the way I approach renal pathology. So